Good afternoon, everyone. Ooh, let me try this again. How can we be with the sports folks and not be energized? Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Awesome. Yeah, no wave. Yeah, that's great. Well, today I want to talk to you a little bit about a book project that Alan and I are working on. It's called Newton's Football. It's going to be coming out in the fall. And I'd like to be your tour guide into another way to look at football. So just by an introduction, my name is Anissa Ramirez, and I'm a scientist by training. I was at Yale for about 10 years, and now I'm an author. And Alan is a New York Times bestselling author, and we're combining our brains together to look at football from a new vantage. How's that sound?
Great.
Okay, great. All right, so it all started with an apple. I'm not talking about Adam and Eve. I'm talking about the apple that hit Sir Isaac Newton on the head. And it gave him inspiration to think about gravity, how the Earth is connected to the sun, and how the moon is connected to the Earth. And he used this small event of a falling apple to remind him of gravity. He used this small event to tell him about a bigger event. And so what I'd like to do is share with you some falling apples, if you will, particularly in football, some small events that made big changes. So today I'd like to mention a couple of falling apples. One is we'll look at these events, and we'll also see what the underlying science is underneath all of these events. So the first we'd like to look at is just the shape of the ball, how the ball shape has changed the game. Then we'll see how that invokes chaos theory. And if this doesn't make sense to you, it will in about half an hour. All right? We'll also talk about Vince Lombardi and how he made a decision, and it invokes game theory. And lastly, I'll talk about the situation that we're currently in, particularly the football helmets, how that has evolved, how it's evolved to have the issues that it has today, and potentially what we can do. And then I'll conclude. So I don't need to tell you that the football has evolved significantly. It started off with a very round shape. It originates from a pig's bladder. So when they say pigskin, they really weren't kidding. And it went from a pig's bladder to something that looks more like a rugby ball to the shape that it is now, which is called a prolate spheroid. Now, in the design change, the game also changed from a game that was more about kicking the ball to a game that's more about carrying the ball. And in doing so, there's been some trade-offs. There's some trade-offs in this design, particularly in how the ball can be controlled. Particularly in the air, we have significant control. We can make lots of yardage. It's also very easy to carry. However, if we were to drop the ball, it's highly erratic. In fact, it's very difficult to pinpoint where a ball will drop. Let's just try an example together. Anybody want to take a vote? All right, so you guys look alive. All right, so if I were to drop this, where might it go? Is it going to go this way, or is it going to go this way? Does anybody want to take a vote? All right, he's saying this way. Any want to take this bet? It's a nickel. This way? All right, that way. All right, so I'm going to drop you. Watch out. All right, went this way. But let's try it one more time. All right. No, well, yes, there's some subtleties to it, of course. I knew this was going to happen at a sports analytics conference. But what I'm trying to say is that there's some unpredictability. And you've seen it yourself. You've seen that football players are gladiators, particularly when they're throwing the ball and they're catching the ball, but they're reduced to kindergartners when it comes to scrambling for the ball when it's fumbled, right? Because we just don't know where it's going to go. And so you may be asking, is this use? This is very cute. Yes, it's randomness, but is it useful? Well, this trade-off between having order, particularly in passing the ball, gives rise to having chaos on the ground. And it's something that we have to be mindful for because chaos is sort of this hidden force that's been active that we just haven't been paying attention to. Let me just give you an example. If we look at two teams, particularly the 49ers and the Rams in the 2011-2012 season, you can see that they both had the same number of forced fumbles on the order of 20. However, the 49ers spent a little bit more time recovering those balls. They recovered about 75% of them, as opposed to the Rams' 30%. And you can see how that translates into how well they performed. So there's this underlying thing. If you're able to control chaos, that might be something to consider in terms of getting to championships. And that all has to do with that falling apple, that is the shape of the ball that invokes chaos or invokes randomness. So let's look at another example of a falling apple. Let's look specifically at Vince Lombardi. Now, Vince Lombardi, as you know, was highly obsessed with winning. In fact, if you look at quotes, they'll have the word win, winning, championship, not being a loser. He has a one-track mind. Now, what you might not know about him is that Vince Lombardi was actually a geek. he actually studied and taught science at St. Cecilia's high school, taught there for 8 years. And so he has a very methodical way of thinking. And he taught there as long as he did as the Packers as well. So he had a very methodical way of thinking, and he brought that to the game of football. He was a modern coach because he studied tape. He gave players grades. He wanted things to be executed with precision. He had that kind of methodical thinking. Now, what's the falling apple? The falling apple is that he lost a game in 1960. And he did this by making some risky decisions, particularly in the fourth down. And the falling apple in this case is that he made a decision that he wasn't going to lose again. Once again, he's very, very set on winning. And so in order to make sure that he had an approach to doing football that would give rise to championships and would guarantee winning and didn't require any risk, he had to invoke John Nash. Now, you might remember John Nash from the movie A Beautiful Mind. Actually, Alan and I have had an opportunity to interface with him a couple of times. Now, John Nash is a pioneer in this field called game theory. And game theory is just a fancy way to say interpersonal decision-making. And if we want to if we are in a game, as they say, if we are in this interaction with another opponent or another person, we make decisions and we consider what their response will be. And for each one of these scenarios, there's different payoffs, as we would say, or different results that will occur. So we try this kind of thinking when we design a football play, and this is what Lombardi invoked. So let me kind of spell out how this might look if we were to do a decision matrix using game theory, and I'll spell this out. Can you guys see over here? Okay, so I'm going to spend some time spelling it out. So let's say that we're the Packers, and we're going to be this column here. And we can choose if we're going to run or if we're going to pass. And above is the Bears, and that's if they're anticipating that if it's going to be a run or a pass. So if we're the Packers and we are going to execute a run and the Bears anticipate it, we'll get 4 yards. That's what the numbers represent. If I do a run and a pass has been anticipated, we get maybe 7 yards. If I choose to pass and the team anticipates that it's going to be a run, I get 9 yards. And if I choose a pass and they believe that it's going to be a pass, then I get no yards. Make sense? Okay, so this is what happens in game theory. Now, once again, Lombardi was not interested in losing. And so he was going to take a path that was going to guarantee winning. I should also say that this is just significant of his time. He wasn't really crazy about passing because it led either to a completion, an incompletion, or an interception. And 2 of the 3 were pretty bad. So the path that he took was actually to execute the run. Even though in modern football, if we were to apply game theory, the trick is to use a lot of different scenarios, make it really random so that the other team can't guess. What Lombardi, his approach was to use the same approach and execute it with such precision that it was unstoppable. And so he would gain 4 yards and 4 yards and 4 yards. And if you look at his number of games, his strategy, over 2/3 of his plays were actually running plays because he wanted to make sure that he would get the yardage in order to win. And so, once again, Lombardi was motivated to win, and he wanted to do it in a low-risk way. He took this approach of not applying randomness, but the same approach every time. That's called a dominant strategy in game theory to ensure that he won. And the rest is history. The rest is history. So let's explore the last falling apple, particularly the helmet that we have today. So the helmet, as you may know, has evolved from a wool hat to a hat that sort of looks like an aviator's hat to the helmet that we have today. And right now we're in the midst of this issue where players are having significant head injuries. Why is that the case? Well, we have to keep in mind of why the helmet was originally developed. The helmet was designed to prevent skull fractures. It is essentially bubble wrap for your head. Now, if you think of your head as an egg, your skull is the shell, and your brain is the yolk inside. And the helmet in its current incarnation is designed to prevent the shell from breaking. but it does nothing to prevent the yoke or your brain from sloshing around. And so we have a helmet that was designed for one purpose, and humans, the players, have evolved to have a new purpose, and that helmet doesn't really satisfy that. So what gave rise to this change in the behavior with the helmet? Well, I would propose, and Alan would propose, that it has to do with the face mask. That's the falling apple. And when did this happen? This happened with Otto Graham. Otto Graham was a quarterback for the Cleveland Brown, and in 1953 he was in a game and got an elbow to the face, and if you notice, the helmet didn't have any kind of face mask, it doesn't have a face mask. He got an elbow to the face, and his face kind of looked like a horror movie afterwards. And so his coach wanted to protect him to make sure that that never happened again, and so Paul Brown made a plexiglass face mask to protect his face, and soon the face mask over time became instituted as a standard issue with helmets. And with that, players actually felt a little bit more confident with how safe they were. In fact, it was a false confidence. So they actually started to use the helmet for a different purpose, where they would spear and tackle with their head, because they had a sense of security based on the face mask. And that's created this new approach, or this unanticipated approach with this subtle change. So this field, there's a field that's called dynamic feedback, where we would propose that this has robustness and fragility. What does that exactly mean? The helmet was designed to protect from skull fractures. So it is robust, that is, it's designed and well apt to protect from skull fractures. However, it is fragile, meaning it's not able to protect from concussions. And so there's this notion of fragility and robustness that occurs. You may have heard of that book, The Black Swan. This is sort of another case of one of these design cycles that happens, where it loses one capacity for another capacity. And this happens with humans all the time. When we create a technology, we have a certain technology that we make, but then the technology also changes our behavior. It's a cycle. This happens all the time. I'll give you an example. The incandescent bulb, which has been around for over 100 years, is not a very efficient way to generate light. In fact, about 70% of it goes to heat, waste heat. I might be one of the few people who had an easy bake oven in here, but that's how you used to cook those little over-sugared pastries. They were heated with an incandescent bulb. And so we decided, especially in this green age, that we wanted to be more efficient, so let's try another way of lighting things up. And so we switched to the LED, and you may see this in the back of car brake lights and also on stop signs. Now, these are tremendously efficient, and they also run cool. So they're robust in terms of how well they are in terms of illumination. But they're fragile with something which we did not suspect, which is snow. So cities have to figure out how to make sure that these stoplights are able to be seen during a snowstorm, because they don't melt off the snow like the incandescent lights. So it's one of these unforeseen trade-offs that occur when you design something. So right now, we're at a critical turning point in terms of what's next in terms of the football helmet. If you were to ask me what's the solution, I'm going to say we need a very big apple. So, and why is that? Because we have many different factors that are moving football into many different directions. And not all of them are in the same direction. Fans, coaches, GMs, they all have different interests in terms of how this football should move. And we'll see in the next couple of years or so where this point settles. So, in summary, you can see that football is a laboratory, just like the laboratories that I sit in. From it, we can see that physics is highly active. We can see the Newtonian physics that's definitely occurring when there's lots of collisions, but you can see other types of physics that are lesser known. That is chaos theory, particularly the randomness of the football when it drops. And that's something that must be mitigated or controlled, because that is one of the underlying forces that can lead to championships, to controlling that. We also see that Vince Lombardi used the strategy of game theory that would make a Nobel laureate extremely happy, because he took a particular approach to ensure that he won championships, and that was a low-risk approach that was executed with precision. And lastly, we can see that right now we're in the midst of a design cycle for the helmet, and the answer is still unknown of where we are going, where we are, but we know that this helmet in its current incarnation is not solving the current injuries that exist, and it's going to require all of us to consider how to solve that. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and if you'd like to know more about how Schrodinger is on the football field, or why woodpeckers do not get concussions, stay tuned in the fall when Newton's Fall football comes out. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Anissa and Alan. We have time for some questions, so if you'll just raise your hand, I'll bring you the microphone.
On the helmet issue, do you think that removing the face mask and maybe replacing it with something that still protects the face but not in such a weaponized way would solve a lot of the concussion crisis, or do you think it's something else?
I think that I think we need a new helmet. The helmet, the way that it's currently designed, needs materials that absorbs impact much better than it weighs. So there are games that don't have helmets that have less concussions, like soccer and the like. That might change, that might modify some behavior, but I actually think that the helmet is the thing that needs to be modified.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. When you reference fumbles, you describe them with the chaos theory.
Yes.
Evidence has suggested that the ability to recover a fumble by a team at this point in time is entirely random, or mostly random. Mm-hmm. Do you foresee going forward a team's ability to, as you said, control chaos and maybe consistently recover fumbles at a higher rate?
Oh boy, the voice is coming from afar. This Alan, he's
Yes.
the expert in football.
Yeah, well, I think the short answer is one, yes, you're completely right. The point is that, again, it is really sort of an entirely random thing for the most part. One, I think, again, both teams that do, teams fumbling and teams forcing fumbles, that's actually a skill. But in terms of actually, once the ball's on the ground, it really does seem random. But the fact is that but it becomes actually a very important force, within the course of a season. Because as you saw, we had the 49ers came very close to winning the Super Bowl, or getting to the Super Bowl. On the other hand, we had, the Rams, again, was one of the factors that basically, made for the sort of season they had, which was really a bad one. So as far as that's concerned, and the fact is, of course, that going forward, a team like the 49ers, even though they have this random aspect to their season and are basically being boosted by that, the fact is then they tend to make decisions based on that. And sometimes it's going to be a good thing and they're going to actually be able to aggressively move towards, a championship mode, which is basically what they did. On the other hand, sometimes it can also be exactly the opposite. In short, they find out that the team really isn't quite as good as they think it is, and basically, they end up making the wrong kind of decisions. In short, they're moving towards the championship when they really should be thinking about rebuilding. So,
yeah, thanks.
Yeah, it's very much random, though.
I would also say the data is still kind of inconclusive, but maybe teams should be working on recovering fumbles. Oh, sorry.
I have a suggestion about your Vince Lombardi slide.
Sure.
You said Vince decided to run the ball 2/3 of the time.
Yeah.
And the optimal mixed strategy in the chart you showed is to run 3/4 of the time. So he actually ran less than optimal.
Yeah. Well, he didn't talk to John Nash, but we actually used the data that he did approach, and so yeah, that's good to know. So he did less than he should have.
Hi, to follow up on the fumbles, have you looked at when the fumbles are occurring? I imagine rate of recovery doing, say, special teams plays or maybe a running back fumbling might be different. So have you looked at specifically when the fumbles are occurring and whether that increases the likelihood of recovery?
We need to parse that out a little bit more. This was just, isn't this interesting, that there may be this aspect that is underlying. And we're still kind of parsing out the data of when they come out. So what we had is some general data that was provided from one source, but now we have to see when these actually happen.
And basically, and it's also really about just sort of the power of randomness, in the course of this. And that's really the point that we're trying to get across. And that said, I really don't think I think it's an important factor, throughout the course of the season. But I think on the other hand, it's not something that necessarily teams are really going to be able to control for. They can control holding on to the ball, but once it's out of their hands, again, it's so random. And again, I actually talked to the folks at EA Sports, and they said in modeling their football games, that was one of the most difficult things that they had to deal with, was
Right.
exactly that,
Right.
just figuring out, making the ball bounce in a realistic way.
Okay. Another question over here?
Yes, this is a theory, but I've read and visited with former NFL players who might be in their 50s or 60s now, and they indicated that it's not really the evolution of the helmet that's unsafe, it's the evolution of the player because they're getting bigger and stronger and faster. Their theory is when we played, we hit with our shoulders and the helmet was just there to protect us if we got a side shot or something of that nature. But players were getting bigger and stronger, knocking down their shoulders and causing shoulder issues, so they started leading with their helmet to get the ball carrier on the ground. Their theory is once we go back, and I see it now in Pop Warner, they're teaching the kids to tackle with their shoulders, so maybe the helmet is not as ineffective as we think, it's how we're using the helmet.
Yeah, that's a good point. I do think, just from a material science point of view, the point of the helmet should be to absorb impact, and the selection of the materials that they're currently using are not particularly good at absorbing impact. But yes, I think changing some behaviors as well is important to not tackle with the head. And we can certainly talk to this. We'll just have the next question.
And I think also just from a technique point of view, yes, there are, and it's actually to the point of getting even beyond the shoulders and actually really essentially tackling with the body, and that's basically how that has to be done. And you're actually seeing guys who are in the Pro Bowl kind of using using subtly different but really fundamentally different kinds of tackling techniques that are fundamentally much safer.
Yeah. So another question.
One question right here. We have time for one more question.
Okay, fair enough.
First of all, thank you for the presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks.
I like the comment on game theory, and obviously play calling in football has evolved a lot. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how much more complex the game theory has gotten and kind of the dynamic between offensive and defensive coordinators, and just if you had any insight on that.
Well, the game theory tells us now for the modern game of football is that you should be random in what you're selecting, running and passing. And so what I was just trying to get across is that Vince Lombardi was just like, I'm just going to mow them down. And so people are applying game theory quite a bit to the game. And the main point that people say is randomize. You want to keep the other team guessing, not being able to predict what you're going to do next. That's what the main point is.
Well, Alan and Anissa, thanks so much. Let's give them a round of applause.
Thank you.
Thanks.